If you think SOC analysts spend most of their time responding to active cyber attacks, the reality is going to surprise you. Most of the work happens before you even know whether something is actually an attack. And that changes everything about how you need to prepare for this role. I'm Professor Simon, and what I want to do today is walk you through what a SOC analyst actually does during a typical shift. Not the Hollywood version, not what the job descriptions make it sound like. What the real work really involves. Because if you're considering this as your entry point into cybersecurity, you need to understand what you're preparing for. Right? So let's first start off with the perception problem. All right, here's what most people picture. You're monitoring dashboards. Alerts come in, you investigate active threats. You're defending the network against sophisticated attackers. It's fast-paced, it's urgent, it's constantly putting your security skills to the test. That's not entirely wrong, but it's incomplete enough to cause real problems. Industry reports put false positive rates somewhere between 60 and 90%, depending on the organization and how well their detection systems are tuned. That means the majority of alerts you investigate aren't attacks at all. They're usually activity that triggered a detection rule. Your job is figuring out which category each one falls into. So the primary work of a SOC analyst isn't responding to confirmed incidents. It's investigating events to determine whether they're actually threats. That distinction changes what skills matter and how you should be spending your preparation time. So what the day actually looks like. So when you start your shift, you've got a queue, an alert queue. Some alerts are new, others were escalated by the previous shift. You work through them, right, systematically. For each alert, you're trying to determine what actually happened, not just what the alert says happened. What actually occurred in the environment. Let's say you've got an alert that someone logged into a server from an unusual location. You need context. Is the user traveling? Are they connected through a VPN? Is there some discrepancy there with the location? What did they do after logging in? What does their recent authentication history look like? Does the account show other signs of compromise? This investigation might take 5 minutes if it's clearly benign. If it may take several hours. If the situation is ambiguous. You're gathering evidence, forming hypotheses, testing those hypotheses against the data. And throughout the process, you're documenting everything. What you checked, what you found, what that information told you. Other analysts need to understand your work if they have to revisit the case later. Incident responders need findings, themselves as well, especially if something happens months down the road. Between investigations, you're communicating with other teams. You're asking IT administrators about scheduled maintenance that might explain unusual system behavior. You're contacting users to verify whether they initiated certain activities. You're updating senior analysts about significant findings. The pace varies. Some shifts bring steady routine alerts. Others involve one long, complex investigation that consumes most of your time. So occasionally you handle actual incidents that require coordination across multiple teams. But most of the hours involve methodical work, determining whether unusual activity is actually suspicious. So as far as one important skill is the investigation skill, right? The core skill here, is investigation, right? So when an alert fires, you don't just categorize it by severity and move on. You figure out what happened. Security tools give you the raw data. A SIM can tell you, that a user accessed 15 servers in 5 minutes. What it can't tell you is whether that's a system administrator running automated configuration scripts or whether it indicates lateral movement by an attacker. That judgment requires understanding both the technical activity and the organizational context. This investigative process isn't linear. You don't follow a simple checklist. You form hypotheses based on initial evidence, then gather additional data to test them. If the evidence doesn't support your hypothesis, you adjust and keep investigating. This requires technical knowledge and analytical thinking working together. So I've seen this play out, when organizations hire, new SOC analysts. I worked with one team that brought in, I think, 2 analysts around the same time. One had recently completed several security certifications and could talk confidently about SIM platforms and detection frameworks. The other had spent a couple of years doing help desk work and system administration. On paper, the first candidate looked more qualified for a security role, but when they started working real alerts, the difference became obviously pretty fast, right? The analyst with the IT background could look at authentication logs and immediately recognize whether the pattern was consistent with how that user normally worked. They understood Active Directory well enough to know what group memberships meant and whether privilege changes made sense. When they saw unusual network traffic, they knew enough about how applications communicate to distinguish between normal behavior and potential problems. The other analysts could operate the security tools just fine. They knew how to query the SIM and pull up the relevant dashboards, but they had to research almost everything about what the data actually meant. They'd see a process running on a Windows server and have to look up whether it was legitimate. They'd encounter a service account and not understand why it had the permissions it did. Both of them got better over time, but the one with the IT foundation was effective much faster. They could ask better questions because they understood the environment they were actually protecting. So, big question here is, why IT fundamentals matter, right? And this is something that people may overlook. The foundational IT knowledge matters more than most people realize when they're preparing for a SOC position or SOC work. Active Directory knowledge might not sound as exciting as threat hunting, but many alerts involve account activity, authentication events, or privilege changes. If you understand how AD actually works, you can quickly assess whether activity is suspicious or routine. When you see an alert about a user being added to a privileged group, you need to know what that group controls, who has authority to make the changes, and whether the timing makes sense. Networking knowledge works the same way. If you understand protocols, ports, and the application communication patterns, you can look at unusual traffic between two systems and determine whether it's legitimate. You can distinguish database replication from potential data exfiltration because you know what each should look like, at the network level at least. Operating system knowledge helps you recognize whether processes are legitimate services or potential malware. You can evaluate whether file modifications indicate routine updates or unauthorized changes. These fundamentals accumulate into investigative effectiveness. Each piece of knowledge eliminates certain possibilities and suggests specific places to look for evidence. An analyst with strong IT foundations reaches accurate conclusions faster with more confidence than someone who relies entirely on what the security tools are telling them. And so another piece of it is learning what normal looks like. And it's the hardest part. It's not really identifying obvious attacks. It's determining whether unusual activity is malicious, misconfigured, or simply uncommon, but legitimate. An application suddenly communicating with an external IP address could be malware establishing command and control. It could also be a legitimate software update mechanism that you weren't aware of. The technical indicators might look similar. How you respond matters enormously. Making this distinction requires environmental knowledge that builds over time. You learn which applications behave oddly. You understand which users have legitimate reasons for unusual access patterns. You recognize how the business processes create security events that look suspicious but aren't. This is why experienced analysts don't view false positive investigations as wasted time. Each investigation teaches you something about your environment actually and how it actually operates. You're building a mental model of normal activity. That model helps you recognize general anomalies much faster. New analysts sometimes try to rely entirely on severity ratings or threat intelligence. Those inputs help, but they can't replace environmental understanding. A low severity alert might indicate serious compromise if you recognize that the affected system never behaves that way. A high severity indicator might be irrelevant if you know it represents activity your organization actually performs regularly. The next step is more about, want to talk about documentation, and communication itself. And it's something that technical people often underestimate, right? Documentation and communication consume substantial time in this role. Every investigation requires documentation. You're recording what you checked, what you found, and what you concluded. This serves multiple purposes. It helps other analysts if the alert resurfaces, it supports escalation decisions, it meets compliance requirements, and honestly, it helps you when you encounter something similar weeks down the road. Communication extends beyond documentation. You regularly interact with IT teams to gather context, you explain findings to users, you brief managers during escalations, you participate in shift handoffs. These communication skills matter as much as technical capabilities. An analyst who investigates thoroughly but documents poorly creates problems for the entire team. Someone who finds important indicators but can't explain them clearly to incident responders limits the organization's ability to respond. And one of the most important judgments you make is deciding what to escalate. This requires balancing several considerations. Escalate too readily and you waste senior resources. You create alert fatigue. When everything gets escalated, nothing gets appropriate attention, right? But failing to escalate actually, incidents, causes obvious problems. Delayed response can turn, containable situations into major breaches. Making sound escalation decisions requires both technical understanding and organizational awareness. You need to recognize technical indicators that suggest genuine threats. You also need to understand your organization's risk tolerance, response capabilities, and priorities. Sometimes it's clear, confirmed malware execution obviously needs immediate escalation. But many situations are ambiguous. Unusual but not clearly malicious activity might warrant escalation depending on the affected systems and organizational context. This judgment improves with experience, but it fundamentally depends on your ability to assess what you're seeing technically and what it means for the organization. And so how do you actually prepare for this? Understanding what SOC analysts really do should change how you prepare. Build hands-on experience with Active Directory, learn about user authentication, group policies, common administrative tasks. Many alerts involve this type of activity, and understanding AD lets you assess these very quickly, right? Learn to read common log sources directly. Practice with Windows event logs, syslogs, web server logs, firewall logs. Don't rely solely on SIM queries that others have written. Understand the raw data that makes you more effective when you need to investigate beyond pre-built dashboards. Develop documentation habits now. When you're troubleshooting IT problems, practice documenting your process. The same structured approach applies to security investigations. Study how business applications and IT processes work in real environments. Understanding normal activity is fundamental to recognizing anomalies. This knowledge comes from practical IT experience, not just security certifications. If you're transitioning from another field, consider gaining practical IT experience before or alongside security-specific training. Help desk work, system administration, network support. These roles build foundational knowledge that makes you more effective in security positions. And as far as a final thought here, SOC analysts' work is fundamentally investigative. You spend most of your time, determining what actually happened, whether it matters, and what should be done about it. This requires solid IT fundamentals, systematic thinking and communication skills as much as familiarity with security platforms. Focus on building that foundational IT knowledge, develop investigative habits, practice documentation and communication. Learn security tools, but recognize they're most valuable when you understand the underlying technology they're actually monitoring. Organizations need SOC analysts who can think through ambiguous situations, investigate systematically, and make sound judgments. They need people who understand how IT environments actually work and distinguish normal from suspicious. Prepare for that reality, and you'll find both the role achievable and rewarding. If you found this helpful, I've got other videos and building practical cybersecurity skills, and prepping for cybersecurity careers that I can share with you, or you can see it on my sites and on my social. But I hope you enjoy this, and until next time, hope to see you later.